Hello from the Dukascopy TV studio in Geneva. We are having an update on the climate change negotiations on the way to the Paris Conference 2015 with Mr. Dirk Forrister. He's President and CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association here in Geneva. Mr. Forrister, welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Daniel. Good to be here again.
So last week's G7 surprised with a commitment to withdraw from fossil fuels within 80 years. So how will this contribute to the Paris conference that will be held at the end of this year?
Well, it should give negotiators a signal about where some of the most important economic players think things need to go on over the long term. At the same time the G7 was meeting, you had negotiators in Bonn, just a few kilometers away, that were grinding out their normal discussions on all of the topics that they have on their plate for Paris. I'm not sure it made a huge difference in Bonn, but you hope that the message gets down to the rank and file negotiators that that's the long-term direction. It's a big challenge, though, to decarbonize that much. So it's a very ambitious goal, and you do count on G7 leaders to be visionaries and to set sort of the tone for where things need to go. But I think it all comes down to where the rubber meets the road right now. How do you start making that transition? And that's really what Paris is about, is getting started on something practical and something effective soon. Because the longer you wait, the harder it gets, the more expensive it gets, and frankly, the more disruptive the solutions could be economically. So I think the business community has an interest in getting clear signals soon about what's needed in the near term.
And can you give us a little overview? What were the key decisions taken in the last months on the way to this Paris conference, which will be held at the end of November 2015?
So the negotiators have several main topics that they're dealing with on the way to Paris. One is around what the mitigation, in other words, the emission reduction commitments will be. Part of it is around how you'll finance the transition. For other countries, it's important to know how they will cope with climate change and what strategies they'll use to adapt, and what assistance they'll get for adapting to the changes in sea level or droughts or floods or whatever the case may be. There's also technology transfer policies. There are policies around building local capacity to respond to climate change. All of these things are on their plate to deal with. And unfortunately, the text that they're working with is really bloated. It's about 80-something pages long, and we expect it'll get trimmed down to maybe 20 pages of pure gold at the end. So that's what they're doing, is trying to go through a process of winnowing down the options and coming to a clear solution at the end of the day. All right, so how to do that? Well, they didn't make very much progress. They talked around it and talked about how do you streamline, how should we, let's get together and see if we can reduce the options. They didn't get very far. So at the end of the day, the big breakthrough they had, and this will sound very simple, but it was important, is that they asked their co-chairs to take a first cut at reducing the size of the text and combining some of the provisions so that it'll be easier to work with. So they're going to come back together at the end of August in Bonn again, and those co-chairs are going to come forward and say, you told us to do this. Here's a slimmer document. Now let's talk about what you like and don't like about it. So that's a different negotiating dynamic, and hopefully it'll help break the logjam. This signal from the G7 could provide some political impetus to do that, but really we've got to see if negotiators get the message from their bosses that it's time to move.
So you mentioned that there might be the direction of searching for lowest common denominator, but like asking in general, so we had the Rio conference, we had the Kyoto Protocol, and now we are heading for this agreement protocol of the Paris conference at the end of this year. So what would be the benefit or the decisive step for this negotiation?
Well, they're setting up a different kind of a structure that will follow after Kyoto, sort of building on the experience of the Kyoto Protocol. And I think it will still be under the broad umbrella of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But really what it's going to do is set a foundation going forward for some of these key program areas that need work. And it's going to talk about how countries work together to achieve those objectives in those areas like finance or markets, emission markets, and that involves cross-border cooperation between companies and trades that occur. They need to get the basics right. Part of it is around how they measure emissions and report emissions and how they account for these various forms of cooperation. So I think that's the challenge, is getting something that accomplishes those results, that happens in actually very few words, be very principle oriented. But that's not the whole story, because once you get the principle document, then they work on implementing decisions. And those can be hundreds of pages long that go through what we think of in business as the regulatory detail about exactly how it's going to work. I don't think Paris will make it that far to get into the implementation detail, but it really has a pure focus on the fundamentals and getting the fundamentals right. I think for the business community, probably the most important thing is getting the signals right on carbon pricing. Carbon pricing gives that economic signal that business needs to start making the transition. For that signal to be right, they need to get the policies around how cross-border trades can work. There are some countries that have no interest in participating in that, countries like Bolivia and Venezuela, but other countries like Europe and China, the United States, it's a core part of their future in climate change to reduce emissions down to the levels that will protect the planet. They're going to have to make reductions on the order of 90% below 1990 levels by 2050. That's what the developed world will have to do. That means complete decarbonization of the power sector. To do that efficiently, you really need to tap into the market flows of being able to look for the cheapest reduction opportunities over time as they occur. One year that might be in a jurisdiction in the US, another year it might be in a jurisdiction in Europe, but you need capital to flow to the places where it can do the most good. And that's what emissions trading is about.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. And finally, so what does this mean then at the end for investors? How could they maybe already take into account what will the results of this Paris Declaration?
Well, I think investors are already awake. They're just looking for policy clarity about how the rules are going to work, and so that they can know that making an investment in a particular renewable technology in a certain jurisdiction is stable, and that it's going to be something that will thrive and deliver returns. So we're seeing more and more investors come into the space. I think they're taking less and less interest in traditional fossil fuel type investments, more interest in the energy strategies of the future that are being developed in renewable energy companies. Actually, I expect big energy companies are going to make that transition so that they also are providers of both types of power, both types of energy. But I think the money is there. It just needs the clarity on the policy side of how to direct it best.
Mm-hmm. So a conference which will certainly have a big impact on sustainability of the business in general.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing for investors is that they know that the Paris Agreement will set overall policy architecture, but the real investment decisions that matter will be in the national systems that emerge under it. So what each nation proposes to do, commits to do, and hopefully they follow through on what they say they're going to do, that's where fortunes will be made or lost, is in the implementation of these programs at national and subnational level.
Thank you very much, Dirk Forrister from the International Emissions Trading Association.
Thank you, a pleasure.
And thanks for watching. Do make sure to keep clicking back on the Dukascopy TV website for latest updates and exclusive interviews. Have a great day and see you next time.